The Wisconsin Department of Justice Fraud Division arrived at Countryside Manor on a Tuesday morning with warrants for financial records. The facility administrator went pale when she saw the agents. By Wednesday afternoon, the Development Corporation's CEO had resigned. By Friday, the state attorney general announced a criminal investigation into systematic land theft targeting elderly farmers. By the end of the month, 17 families had property transfers reversed, and 3 executives faced charges including fraud, elder exploitation, and racketeering. Everyone in 3 counties eventually knew the name Tom Harrison, not as the elderly man in room 9 who used a walker, but as the retired editor of the Millerton Weekly Herald, who had spent 45 years exposing corruption and had just broken the biggest story of his career. It all started with 18 words he wasn't supposed to hear. Mr. Harrison's farmland is worth $2 million for the new subdivision. His son already has the development contract. Just need the old man to sign the sale papers, and he's too confused to know what he's losing. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and like the video for your support. Thank you for subscribing. Tom Harrison woke at 6:15 a.m. on a Thursday in October, the same time he'd woken for 45 years to get the Millerton Weekly Herald to press. His body didn't care that the paper had been sold 3 years ago, that someone else ran it now, that his editor's desk sat empty or occupied by a stranger. Some rhythms ran deeper than retirement. The room was quiet, the early autumn light soft through thin curtains. He could hear the building settling, the hum of the heating system cycling on, the distant clatter of the kitchen staff preparing breakfast 3 floors below. Countryside Manor smelled like every institutional building he'd ever investigated as a journalist. Industrial cleaner, overcooked coffee, and something indefinably sad beneath it all. Tom pushed himself upright carefully. At 80, every movement required thought. The hip replacement from last year worked fine, but getting vertical still took time. He reached for the walker beside his bed, sturdy aluminum, tennis balls on the back legs to protect the floors. Not what he'd imagined for himself at this age, but then he'd always figured he'd die at his desk, red pen in hand, fighting with layout right up until deadline. His room was small, but he'd made it his. Books lined every available surface: history, journalism, local Wisconsin lore. Framed front pages from the Herald hung on the walls. Millerton factory closes after 80 years. Vietnam veterans return home. County commissioner resigns amid corruption probe. That had been his story, his investigation. On his desk sat his old Underwood typewriter, non-functional but preserved, and his Associated Press Award from 1987 for investigative journalism. On the dresser was a photograph of Ellen, his wife of 53 years, taken at the farm in 2019. She stood by the old oak tree his grandfather had planted in 1952, smiling that quiet smile that had sustained him through decades of small-town journalism. Ellen had died in 2021, pneumonia that had come on fast and taken her faster. Everything after that had been a slow process of losing pieces of himself. The house too empty, the farm too much to manage alone. His daughter Sarah urging him to make a plan before something happens. His son Blake had made the plan for him. "Dad, I found the perfect place. Countryside Manor, right here in Wisconsin, nice facility. They specialize in helping farmers transition from farm life. You'll be safe there, someone to check on you, meals provided, no more worrying about the property." The property. The Harrison family farm, 200 acres of prime Wisconsin land that Tom's great-grandfather had homesteaded in 1889. 4 generations of Harrisons had worked that soil, raised crops and cattle, built the white farmhouse that still stood solid despite its age. Tom had grown up there, had taken over from his father in 1970 while working at the paper, had passed it to Blake when farming full-time became too much. Except Blake hadn't farmed it. He'd leased it out, let others work the land while he pursued his career in development, a word Tom had never fully trusted. Blake worked for Heartland Development Corporation, some big company out of Milwaukee that bought rural land for suburban expansion. Good money, Blake said, future-oriented. "Not everyone can be a farmer anymore, Dad. Times change." Blake had arranged everything for Countryside Manor, found the facility, handled the paperwork, set up the trust to manage Tom's pension and Social Security. "This way, you don't have to worry about finances or bills or property management. I'll handle everything. You just enjoy your retirement." Tom had been too tired to argue, too grieving Ellen's loss to fight about details. He'd signed the papers Blake brought, moved his essentials to room 9, tried to adapt to institutional life. That had been 11 months ago. 11 months of small rooms and scheduled meals and activities designed for people with dementia. 11 months of watching the world through a window instead of investigating it with a reporter's notebook. 11 months of slowly realizing that something about Countryside Manor didn't sit right. The breakfast cart arrived at 7:30 a.m. Monica brought his tray: eggs, toast, weak coffee, small paper cup of medications, blood pressure pill, aspirin, vitamin D. "Morning, Mr. Harrison," Monica said with professional cheerfulness. "Morning, Monica. How's your father doing?" Tom remembered everything he was told, another journalist habit, built over decades of interviews and local coverage. "Better, thanks for asking. Physical therapy's helping." She smiled, genuine for a moment, then moved to the next room. Always moving, always behind schedule. Countryside Manor ran lean, Tom had noticed, in minimum staff, maximum residents. Profit margins over care quality. After breakfast, Tom made his way to the common room with his walker. He'd learned the building's rhythms, residents who were alert versus those deep in dementia, staff schedules and shift changes, the daily patterns that revealed how a place actually operated versus how it presented itself. He'd been a journalist for 45 years. You couldn't turn that off. You noticed things. You asked questions. You wondered why certain answers didn't quite add up. Like Mr. Peterson from room 14, who'd mentioned 3 weeks ago that his daughter was helping him simplify his estate. 2 weeks later, Mr. Peterson had signed papers he didn't seem to understand. 1 week after that, Tom heard Mr. Peterson's daughter telling someone on the phone that the farm sold for exactly what we hoped. Dad's in a facility now, so he doesn't need to know the details. Or Mrs. Kowalski from room 22, whose grandson had visited frequently until she'd signed something during an estate planning session the facility arranged. After that, the grandson stopped visiting. Mrs. Kowalski kept asking about her farmhouse, seemed confused about why she couldn't go home. Or Mr. Chen from room 7, whose family farm had been in transition, according to his son. Mr. Chen had been upset, agitated, saying someone stole his land. Staff had increased his medications, called it dementia-related paranoia. But Tom had heard Mr. Chen's son on the phone in the family visiting area. The development company finalized the purchase. Dad signed everything during that cognitive assessment. No, he doesn't remember. That's the beauty of it. Patterns. A journalist's best tool. 1 incident was an anecdote. 2 was a coincidence. 3 or more was a story. Tom had counted 7 residents with similar trajectories: family farms, estate planning assistants from the facility, signatures on papers during assessments or therapy sessions, property transfers that the residents either didn't remember or didn't understand. 7 families losing generational land. 7 sets of children or grandchildren benefiting financially. 7 elderly farmers confused about what had happened to the properties they had worked their entire lives. And Blake kept asking when Tom might be ready to discuss the farm's future. Blake, who visited every Sunday with papers for Tom to review when you have time. Blake, who worked for Heartland Development Corporation, which specialized in converting farmland to suburban subdivisions. Tom sat in his usual chair by the window, watching the Wisconsin farmland roll away toward the horizon. October colors, gold and red and rust-brown fields. He'd grown up on land like that, had spent his whole life writing about the people who worked it, small-town America, rural values, the backbone of the country. At least that's what politicians said during election years. Then those same politicians approved development that turned farms into strip malls and housing developments. Let corporations buy up family land for economic growth. Watch small towns hollow out as young people left, and old people got warehoused in facilities like this. Tom had written about it in the Herald. Development or destruction? Millerton Faces Crossroads had been his 2018 series about farmland loss. He'd interviewed families, documented the pressure from development companies, shown how corporate interests were erasing rural heritage. And now he was living the story from the inside. At 10:30 a.m., Tom was still sitting in the common room, appearing to doze but actually listening to the administrative offices down the hall. The door was open slightly. Poor security. Another institutional failing he'd noted. 2 voices, female. One was Janet, the facility administrator. The other was Melissa, who ran the Wellness and Estate Planning program. Harrison's son is pushing for the farm transfer this month, Melissa was saying. He's got buyers lined up, development contracts ready, just needs his father's signature. Is Mr. Harrison competent to sign? Janet asked. Technically, yes. He's sharp as hell. But Blake thinks we can get him to sign during one of our financial wellness sessions. Position it as simplifying estate management and reducing burden on family. Most of them sign when we frame it right. They want to help their kids, don't realize they're signing away property. What if he refuses? Blake said he'd pursue incompetency proceedings if necessary, get him declared unable to manage his affairs, take guardianship, force the sale. But that takes time and looks bad. Better if the old man signs voluntarily. Mr. Harrison's farmland is worth $2 million for the new subdivision. His son already has the development contract. Just need the old man to sign the sale papers, and he's too confused to know what he's losing. Tom's hands tightened on his walker. He kept his eyes closed, his breathing even, his body language unchanged. But his mind was moving with the sharp focus he'd used writing investigative pieces. They were stealing farms, systematically, using the facility as a pipeline, get elderly farmers placed here by family members who worked for or with development companies, then extract property transfers through coercion, confusion, or outright fraud. Frame it as estate planning or reducing burden when it was actually theft. If residents refused, pursue guardianship to force the sales. And Blake was part of it, his son, the boy Tom had raised, taught values to, tried to instill with integrity. Blake had put him here specifically to steal the Harrison family farm, 4 generations. From 1889, when Tom's great-grandfather cleared the land with his own hands. Through the Depression, when Tom's grandfather kept the farm, despite foreclosures everywhere else. Through the war years, when Tom's father worked it alone after his brothers died in Europe. Through Tom's own years balancing farming with journalism. Keeping both alive because both mattered. 200 acres that had fed families, employed workers, anchored a community. And Blake wanted to turn it into a subdivision called something like Heritage Meadows or Farmland Commons, names that commodified the history they destroyed. Tom returned to his room, closed the door, sat on his bed with his hands shaking, not from age or illness, from rage and betrayal and the recognition that his own son had become exactly the kind of corrupt developer Tom had spent his career exposing. But rage wasn't useful. He'd learned that in 45 years of journalism. Rage clouded thinking, made you sloppy, turned you into a crusader instead of a reporter. What he needed was what he'd always needed: facts, documentation, sources, evidence. He needed to investigate. That evening, Tom requested access to the facility's computer in the resident library. "I'd like to email some old friends," he told the aide. "Keep up with people from the paper." The computer had internet access, filtered, monitored probably, but functional. Tom logged into his old Herald email account, still active though he rarely used it. He sent a message to Lucy Chen, his former investigative reporter, who now worked at the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. "Lucy, it's Tom Harrison. I think I've stumbled onto a story up here in Millerton. Systematic land theft targeting elderly farmers, development corporation involved, possible fraud, and elder exploitation. Can you help me research? Tom." Lucy replied within 2 hours. "Tom, of course I'll help. What do you need?" Over the next 3 days, Tom and Lucy exchanged emails. She researched Heartland Development Corporation, found it was owned by a private equity firm, had purchased over 2,000 acres of Wisconsin farmland in the past 5 years, had multiple development projects converting rural land to suburbs. She found property records showing farms owned by Countryside Manor residents suddenly transferring to shell companies, then to Heartland Development. She found guardianship filings, families pursuing incompetency declarations for elderly relatives who owned valuable land. She found patterns across 3 counties, all connecting to Countryside Manor and Heartland Development. "Tom, this is huge," Lucy wrote. "This is RICO-level organized fraud. You've got a major investigation here. We need more evidence, testimony from victims, internal documents, proof of systematic coordination." Tom wrote back, I can get it. I've been a reporter longer than you've been alive. I know how to build a story. But he also knew he was 80 years old, using a walker, living in the facility he was investigating, with limited mobility and resources. This wasn't 1987 when he could chase down sources and file Freedom of Information requests and camp out in government offices demanding records. This required different tactics, slower, quieter, more patient. The kind of investigation you did when you were embedded in the story itself. He started with the other residents. Carefully, slowly, he asked questions. Mr. Peterson, did you want to sell your farm? Mrs. Kowalski, do you remember signing papers about your property? Mr. Chen, tell me about your land, what happened to it? Most were too impaired to answer coherently, but some remembered fragments. Mrs. Anderson from room 11 said her daughter had promised the farm, would stay in the family, then suddenly it was sold, and her daughter bought a new Mercedes. Mr. Washington from room 16 said he'd signed papers during a memory test and didn't understand what they were until later, when his son mentioned the land was sold. Tom took no written notes, too risky if staff found them, but he remembered everything, organized it mentally, like he'd done organizing stories before digital tools existed. He watched the wellness sessions where Melissa brought residents for estate planning, watched residents sign papers they clearly didn't understand, watched families visit afterward, suddenly friendlier, suddenly more attentive, the way people acted when they'd just profited from something they felt guilty about. On a Tuesday afternoon, Blake visited with his usual stack of papers. Dad, I brought some documents for you to look over, just estate stuff, making sure everything's organized for when, well, for the future. Tom looked at his son, 48 years old, expensive suit, developer's confidence. When had Blake become this? When had ambition replaced values? What kind of documents? Tom asked. Just property management agreements, transferring the farm to a trust I'll manage. Makes things simpler, protects the asset, ensures it's handled properly. Handled properly how? Well, developed responsibly. The land's worth a fortune now, Dad. Sitting on it doesn't make sense when we could turn it into a subdivision, Tom finished quietly. Erase 4 generations of family history for profit. Blake's expression flickered. It's about smart estate planning. It's about stealing my land while I'm alive by getting me to sign it over in a facility you chose specifically for that purpose. Tom's voice was steady, factual, the tone he'd used interviewing corrupt officials. Heartland Development has been using Countryside Manor as a pipeline for elderly farmers. Get them placed here, extract property transfers through confusion or coercion, flip the land for development, and you're part of it. Blake stood abruptly. Dad, you're confused. The hip replacement medications affect your thinking sometimes. I'm not confused. I'm a journalist. I've been investigating this facility and your company for 3 weeks. I know exactly what you're doing. You're 80 years old living in a nursing home. You use a walker. You're not investigating anything. Blake's voice had hardened. Sign the papers, Dad. Make this easy, or I'll pursue guardianship and take control anyway. You threatening me, Blake? I'm trying to help you, but you're making it difficult. Blake gathered his papers. I'll give you a week to think about it. If you won't sign voluntarily, I'll file the guardianship petition. The court will appoint me as guardian, and I'll authorize the sale anyway. He left. Tom sat in his room, Walker beside him, 80 years old and facing his son's betrayal with the cold clarity he'd always brought to hard stories. Blake had made a mistake, though. He'd threatened guardianship proceedings. That meant court filings, legal process, public records. It meant the story would generate documentation Tom could use. And it meant Tom had maybe a week to gather the evidence needed to break this story before Blake moved to silence him legally. That night, Tom couldn't sleep. He sat in his chair by the window, looking out at the dark Wisconsin farmland, thinking about his great-grandfather who'd cleared trees with an axe and a dream, thinking about the decades of Harrisons who'd made that land productive, thinking about Ellen, who'd loved the old oak tree and the white farmhouse and the whole sweep of sky that you only got in rural America. He thought about his years at the Herald, the stories he'd broken, the corruption he'd exposed. He'd always believed journalism mattered, that sunlight was the best disinfectant, that a free press could hold power accountable. Now he needed to prove it one more time. The next morning, Tom asked for a meeting with Janet, the administrator. I need to discuss some concerns about the facility's estate planning program. Janet agreed to meet in her office. Tom navigated there with his walker, settled carefully into a chair, and looked at her with the steady gaze he'd used in 1,000 interviews. "I know what you're doing," he said. "Targeting elderly farmers, extracting property transfers, coordinating with development companies. I've documented patterns, talked to residents, researched property records. It's systematic fraud." Janet's expression went carefully neutral. "Mr. Harrison, I think you're misunderstanding. I was an investigative journalist for 45 years. I don't misunderstand fraud. I know how to recognize it, document it, and prove it. You're making serious accusations without evidence? I have plenty of evidence, and I'm going to publish it." Tom leaned forward slightly. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to give me access to all estate planning records for residents here. You're going to provide documentation of your relationship with Heartland Development. You're going to cooperate fully with my investigation. Or I'm going to contact the Wisconsin Department of Justice, the FBI, and my former colleague who now runs investigative reporting at the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, and they're going to tear this place apart." Janet stared at him. "Mr. Harrison, you're an elderly man in a care facility. Who's going to believe you? Everyone who remembers that I spent 4 decades exposing corruption and was never wrong once." Tom's voice was quiet but certain. "I'm old. I use a walker. I live in a nursing home. But I'm still a journalist, and I still know how to break a story. The only question is whether you cooperate now or get exposed later. Your choice." He stood, gripped his walker, left her office without waiting for a response. He knew what would happen next. Janet would contact Heartland Development, probably Blake directly. They'd escalate, either try to force him out, increase pressure for the guardianship filing, or perhaps even try to have him medicated into silence. He'd seen it all before, just from the other side of the notebook. Powerful interests protecting themselves, trying to discredit whistleblowers, using every tool available to maintain control. But he'd also seen corruption exposed, watched powerful people fall, documented how truth eventually surfaced when someone was brave enough or stubborn enough or principled enough to keep pushing. He emailed Lucy. "Story's about to break either way. Confronted the administrator. They'll move against me now. Be ready to publish if something happens. I've documented everything I can mentally. If they try to silence me, you'll need to take over the investigation." Lucy replied immediately. "Tom, get out of there. This isn't safe. These people have money and lawyers, and they'll destroy you." "They can't destroy me, Lucy. I'm 80 years old. Worst they can do is kill me, and I've had a good run. But they can't unbreak the story. Once it's out there, it's out there. That's what journalism means." 2 days later, Blake filed guardianship papers. Tom received notice that a competency hearing was scheduled for the following week. If the court found him incapable of managing his affairs, Blake would become his legal guardian with control over all decisions, including property sales. Tom called Lucy. "I need you to attend my competency hearing next week. Bring a court reporter. Document everything. If they try to declare me incompetent, that's part of the story. How development corporations silence elderly victims." Lucy agreed. She also contacted the Wisconsin Department of Justice and the FBI field office in Milwaukee, providing them with Tom's research and allegations. Both agencies opened preliminary investigations. The competency hearing was held at the county courthouse on a Tuesday morning. Tom dressed in his best clothes, suit he hadn't worn in a year, tie Ellen had given him, shoes he'd polished the night before. He used his walker but stood straight, maintained dignity, looked like what he was, an elderly journalist who'd spent his life telling truth. Blake's lawyer argued that Tom was suffering age-related cognitive decline, was paranoid and delusional, was making wild accusations against family and facility staff, was unable to manage a 200-acre farm property or make sound financial decisions. Then Tom testified. He explained his background, 45 years as editor and investigative reporter, awards for journalism, reputation for accuracy and integrity. He laid out the evidence he'd gathered, 7 residents with similar patterns of property loss, documented connections between Countryside Manor and Heartland Development, property records showing systematic transfers, his own son's role in the scheme. He spoke for 23 minutes without notes, organized and factual and completely coherent. When he finished, the judge looked at Blake's lawyer and said, This man does not appear incompetent to me. He appears to be conducting an investigation. The guardianship petition was denied. But more importantly, Lucy had brought a reporter from the Journal Sentinel who'd filmed the entire hearing. That evening, the footage was online. By morning, it had gone viral. Elderly journalist exposes land theft scheme. His own son tried to silence him through false incompetency claim. The Wisconsin Attorney General announced a full investigation 2 days later. FBI agents arrived at Countryside Manor with warrants. They seized records, interviewed staff, examined property transfers going back 5 years. They found exactly what Tom had documented, a systematic scheme where Heartland Development worked with Countryside Manor to target elderly farmers, extract property through fraud or coercion, then flip the land for suburban development. 17 families affected across 3 counties, millions in fraudulent transfers. Blake had personally profited from 8 separate farm acquisitions, including his own father's land, which he'd attempted to steal through the guardianship proceeding. Criminal charges were filed within 3 weeks. Janet and Melissa from Countryside Manor faced fraud and elder exploitation charges. Heartland Development's executives faced RICO charges for organized criminal conspiracy. Blake faced multiple felonies, including attempted theft, fraud, and exploitation of a vulnerable adult, his own father. The story dominated Wisconsin news for weeks. National outlets picked it up. CNN, NPR, the networks. The elderly journalist who exposed the son who tried to steal his family farm. David versus Goliath. Small-town values against corporate greed. A morality tale for modern America. Tom testified at the trials. Walked to the witness stand with his walker. Swore the oath. Told the truth with the same precision he'd used in 45 years of journalism. His testimony was devastating, factual, organized, impossible to discredit. All defendants were convicted. Blake received 7 years for multiple counts of fraud and elder exploitation. The judge specifically noted in sentencing that the defendant's betrayal of his own father, a man who dedicated his life to public service through journalism, represents a particularly egregious moral failing. The Harrison farm was protected. The attempted transfer was voided. The property returned to Tom's control. He couldn't work it anymore. Physically couldn't maintain 200 acres alone, but he ensured it stayed intact, leased to a young farming family who'd keep it agricultural, protected by conservation easements that prevented future development. 17 other families recovered their land or received restitution. Countryside Manor's license was permanently revoked. Heartland Development filed bankruptcy after settlements and legal fees. And Tom Harrison, at 80 years old, had broken the biggest story of his career. He moved back home, not to the farm exactly, but to a small apartment in Millerton with home health aides for assistance. He could walk the downtown streets he'd known his whole life, see the people he'd covered for decades, still feel part of the community he'd spent his career documenting. The Weekly Herald asked him to write a column, monthly pieces about rural Wisconsin, farmland preservation, the importance of local journalism. He wrote them on his old Underwood typewriter, which he'd gotten working again, then transcribed them to email for publication. On a morning in late spring, Tom sat at his desk with coffee and the sunrise coming through the window. He was writing about his great-grandfather, about homesteading, about what it meant to work land for 4 generations, about the value of things that couldn't be reduced to real estate development potential. Blake called sometimes from prison. Tom answered every few months, listened to apologies and regrets, offered no forgiveness, but no cruelty either. "Maybe when you get out," Tom told him. "Maybe we can talk then. But I need you to understand what you lost before I can forgive what you tried to steal." His daughter Sarah visited every week, brought grandchildren, tried to make up for Blake's betrayal, though it wasn't her fault. She helped manage the farm lease, handled details Tom couldn't manage himself, proved that not all children forgot family values. And Lucy Chen wrote him every week, shared updates about the story's continued impact. New investigations in other states, legislation proposed to protect elderly landowners, journalism awards for their collaborative investigation. "You did it, Tom," she wrote in one email. "You proved that age doesn't diminish integrity, that journalism still matters, that one person telling the truth can change systems. Thank you for teaching me that." Tom looked out his window at Millerton's main street, the library, the diner, the post office. the empty storefront where the Herald had been before it was sold. Small-town America, struggling but surviving, worth protecting even when corporations saw only profit potential in its destruction. He'd spent 45 years telling stories about places like this, about people who worked the land and built communities and maintained values. Then he'd spent 11 months living the hardest story he'd ever covered. The betrayal of those values by his own son. The attempt to erase 4 generations of family history for suburban development. Thomas Harrison was 80 years old, used a walker, had arthritis and a replaced hip and all the physical limitations of age. But he was still a journalist in every way that mattered, still asking questions, still seeking truth, still believing that stories mattered, that documentation could defeat corruption, that sunlight was the best disinfectant. He finished his column, sent it to the Herald, and started thinking about next month's piece. Maybe something about the young family leasing the farm, about new generations learning old values, about continuity and hope and the slow, patient work of preserving what mattered. Some stories he'd learned you never stopped reporting, some fights you never stopped fighting, and some values, truth, integrity, family, community, the land itself, were worth protecting no matter what it cost, no matter who betrayed them, no matter how old you were when the fight found you. He looked at the photograph of Ellen on his desk, smiled at her quiet smile, and kept writing.